Let's blow the lid off this right now. The whole Jurassic Park franchise is just a straight rip-off of Rincemangle, the Gnome of Even Moor.
Hi, I'm Ben McKenzie, and not Elizabeth Flux. Welcome to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast. Each month, we discuss one of Terry Pratchett's books or short stories with a special guest. This month, we're reading Rincemangle, the Gnome of Even Moor, which luckily for me already has a pun in it, because sadly, Liz can't be with us this month to provide one. And our guest is comedy writer, podcaster, and author Andy Matthews. Welcome, Andy.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on your wonderful podcast. It's an honour and it's a very exciting thing to be included.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. You are, of course, and this is true of so many of the people we have on the show, a massive Terry Pratchett fan.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. You know, like I guess like a lot of people, I'm somebody who dropped off at a certain point, but there was a very, very intense and sustained period of heavy to industrial grade Pratchettism through my teens and early 20s. Yeah,
you're making it sound vaguely filthy, but that's okay. We're all right with that. Did you get back on the wagon later in life?
Only very recently. Like, I think basically just the internet and computers destroyed my brain for a really long period of time, and I basically forgot how to read. And yeah, then not that long ago, I picked up Feet of Clay, and I was completely overwhelmed by the volume of jokes and the quantity, and the incredible craft of the story structure. And, it's really fantastic to take that, unintentional break and to come back now just with a bit more awareness. And actually able to get some of the jokes, because looking back, I'm like, now I'm amazed I enjoyed the books at all, because I don't think, I'm reading through it. I'm like, I didn't get that joke. I didn't get that joke. I didn't get that joke at the time. And now it's all there. I've read it all. It's all gone in. And now it's, you reread it and it suddenly crystallizes into this shape. You're like, oh God, these aren't just words. But yeah, just the way in which it's all put together. It's really incredibly good stuff. Yeah, so I've just been, pulling out my old copies and, rereading a few things. And I recently reread A Life with Footnotes, which has really inspired me to read a lot more again as well. But yeah, no, I used to absolutely be, I would get a Terry Pratchett book for my birthday. I would get a Terry Pratchett book for Christmas, and I would read them I would devour them, to use that cliche, and I would read them, and I would stay up so late. It was affecting my life. I was not doing well at school. I would take them into classes, and I remember getting told off for reading them under the table in maths. But, I would read it all the way through, and then I would just straight away turn around and just read it again straight away, because I just had to have it. And seeing a new book on the shelf or finding an older one in a secondhand bookshop that I hadn't read was just such an incredible, that look that they had with those old Kidby covers.
Mm.
You could pick them out if you knew what you were looking for. You could pick them out from on a shelf. Just the spines. You could just those weird bulbous shapes. You could see them from the other end of the secondhand bookshop, and just It was just like gold. It was just like, It
was like finding a nugget. It was like a lumpy nugget of literary cover gold.
A lumpy, bulbous nugget. Yeah. They are quite nuggety. Those covers. There is.
They
a lot
are
of that.
all the muscly characters, and
rippling, and there is a lot of golds and.
We've often remarked on the lumpiness of the Kidby style. The Kirby style, I should say. I mean,
sorry, I said Kidby, I meant Kirby, but it's
no.
I won't be the first person to have made that mistake.
No, I mean, look, it's Pratchett's fault for going from one illustrator to another who had such similar names. It's very difficult for all of us.
Well, he didn't waste anything, and why waste a good 4/5 of that name?
He did like the matchstick trick, where you turn a number into another number, but he did it with the name of one artist into another artist. Have you read all of them, or are there still a few that you've never read?
There are still a few that I've never read. Probably, post like 2005, I haven't caught up with a bunch of them, and that makes me sad. But I know that I will at one point. Yeah.
That is, look, there's some joy in your future. There's some really great stuff in those last 10 years. Yeah, that's exciting. I'm excited for you, Andy.
Oh, great.
What a treat.
Thanks. There's something to look forward to in life.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people got into the Discworld and kind of just read that. But did you, when you were really into him, you were devouring all these books every night.
Oh.
Did you read his other work as well?
Yeah, of course. Everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all grist for the mill, you got to feed the furnace, and you'll chuck in Strata, you'll throw in the Dark Side of the Sun. It's whatever it takes. The beast is hungry.
You just whatever you can get, whatever Pratchett you can get is the best Pratchett.
Your Johnnies, your Bromeliads, which you got to say, what an absolutely phenomenal pun. What an absolutely breathtakingly puns are very rarely beautiful and weighty and heartbreaking almost. How could it all be in there? It's just...
I don't know.
It defies everything. The name, the Bromeliad, for the series, did that also emerge later? Because the Bromeliad is just a metaphor early on. We're getting into it here, but if you've covered truckers already, people know...
They should know.
Yeah.
I mean, if you haven't listened to our episodes, we have covered Truckers, Diggers and Wings, all three books. Quite early on, we did them in our first couple of years. I was actually reading about this today because I have not been able to fully clarify this. My understanding is the name Bromeliad came about, I think, and this might not be right, and I've found it difficult to verify, when they were first collected into a single volume. And they were always called that when they were published together in the United States.
Yes.
But I think only some early and then much later editions were called that in the UK, where they were also just called the Book of the Gnomes or the Gnome Trilogy. So, which seems interesting to me because normally you expect the weird classical illusion name to be the one that the UK gets and not the one that they change it to in America. So I don't know. If you know, listener, I've not had a whole bunch of luck confirming any of that. It's one of the things that's not everything is actually that easy to find out on the internet. It's just a random massive pile of facts, and some facts are harder to find than others. So if you know,
to
let
be
us
clear,
know.
what I really want to know is I want to know when Terry put the Bromeliad, the plant, as a metaphor for journeying and
I see.
Transcending your wherever you are, going to another place, all that sort of stuff. When he put that in Truckers, did he know that there was a pun to be had on the Iliad that would turn out to be incredibly useful if he wanted a title for a trilogy of these books? There's no way he could have known. I can't believe it. I can't believe that he would have done that and not made use of that pun at the earliest opportunity.
Well, just to clarify, as we didn't remember this during the discussion, Pratchett absolutely did not think of the Bromeliad pun during the writing of Truckers, because the Bromeliad doesn't appear in the story until the second book, Diggers, by which time he definitely knew it would be a trilogy. But it's still a mystery to us which idea came first, its use in the narrative, or its use as the name of the trilogy. Please let us know if you have any insight. Yeah, because I think that's the crux, right? Like, if he'd known, he would have done it. Because
Yes.
I think you could have called that first book, you could have called just the first book The Bromeliad, and it could have been like because, it is the story of a journey.
Indeed.
It's not a very strong analogous journey to the Iliad. I mean, I'm sure if you pick apart the whole trilogy, there's lots of bits that make sense in that. But in general, it's just a general epic journey, but much smaller. So it makes the pun works on so many levels, Andy.
Yes. Yes.
So
I think.
yeah, I don't know. I feel like he loved doing research, and he loved also finding things during his research that he seemed he would just write down. This is the impression I get. I don't know if he's literally said this anywhere, but the impression I get is he obviously did a lot of research, but he would often find interesting facts while he was researching something else, and he'd write it down and go, "That's good. That should go in a book later," because he never wasted anything. As we're about to talk about with this story that turned into a whole 3 other books. He never wasted anything. If he found something interesting, pop it in a drawer. And I don't know whether the pun would have occurred to him then. I think your theory, I'm sold on your idea that, he just put it in as a metaphor and then later on was like, that's a great name. We should use that.
What a beautiful thing. And I think what that speaks to is that if you're shoving this much interesting stuff into your books, you can then, within that world that you've created, still discover things. Like if he wouldn't have been able to discover that in there if he hadn't, gone to great lengths to like shove in this really interesting idea. Anyway, we're off topic.
No, we're not off topic. I think this is fine. We'll come back to the Bromeliad and truckers, I think. But we should get into the story because we are here to discuss Rincemangle, the Gnome of Even Moor, which again, that is another pun there, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
When we read a book, we read the blurb before we get into the discussion of the book. Obviously, there's no blurb for a short story. So here's what he had to say about Rincemangle, the Gnome of Even Moor, which will contextualize the conversation we've already started having. This is one of the pieces I used to do on Thursday evenings, an earlier and shorter version of what became Truckers. The name of the protagonist finds an echo in the later creation of Rincewind, the wizard, who first appears in The Colour of Magic. The thing about these author's notes is that some of them are quite interesting and insightful and tell you something you never knew, and other ones are like, that's just a description of what this is. We know this already. But that's okay. That's all right.
You know what I got out of that is one of the pieces that I used to do on a Thursday evening, and I'm assuming that means that he wrote all of this in a single evening, right?
Oh,
No?
No, not the whole thing. No, because it was serialized, you see. So he wrote this for the Children's Circle was a column. It was like a children's page in this local newspaper, the Bucks Free Press, that he worked at for quite a while. And one of his jobs, because he enjoyed writing fiction and he was a junior reporter there, actually he might not have been a junior reporter. I think he was like a sub-editor or something. I can't remember what his actual role was. But anyway, one of his jobs there was to write stories for the children's page. And so this came out a little bit at a time. And basically everywhere where there's I don't actually know what the term for this is. Do you know, Andy? You're an author. You must know this. When there's that gap and then in between paragraphs in the story, there is a name for that, and I can never remember what it is. Do you know what the name for that is?
We call that a paragap. I know.
A paragap?
No, I didn't. I made that up.
Okay, well, now it's a paragap. Look, 100 people are already composing an email or a tweet or a toot or something to let us know what it's actually called. But anyway, disappointingly, and regardless of whether it's just blank space or has asterisks or some other ornamentation, the gap we're talking about doesn't have a special jargon name. It's just called a section break, which reminds me depressingly of Microsoft Word. What I mean is, in this story where there's that gap where, it's like a new scene in a film, I think that's like 1 week's installment. Okay, so he was writing that every Thursday, not the whole thing.
Yeah, right. Because I knew about the Bucks Free Press and the Uncle Jim or whatever it was called, the section that he did for children in there. And reading this, because this is the first time I've read this short story for this podcast, reading it, I was like, this is a very long story to put into a podcast, into a newspaper. And I should have, of course, realized that it was split up in that way. And that makes sense because there is at least one of those paragraphs in the story where it resets and re-explains where you're up to in a way that's quite jarring if you're reading it all as one short story.
It feels very familiar if you're, an old school Doctor Who fan. You're used to, watching a couple episodes in a row where, that music comes in just near the end of the episode when things go wrong, and it's like, and then the next week it goes back, 30 seconds or a couple of minutes and shows you that scene again, so you've got context for why things are so bad. So it was a little bit like that for me, but much shorter.
It's the old, insert tab A into slot B. Connective tissue.
Exactly.
Doctor Who universe.
Yeah. I don't know how much he edited it for this sort of republished altogether version. I get the impression maybe not very much.
Yes, I do as well.
But I do like that it means it's split up into like 8 little chunks. And I don't know about you. Have you read any of his like really early like children's stories before? Is this your first one?
This is the first one, that I've come to. And it's very interesting reading this straight after reading A Life with Footnotes and being able to sort of put it all into a context of where he was and what he was doing at that time. So I think he was 25 when he did this, and he would have been at Bucks Free Press for quite a while.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And he's really, I guess, at this, by doing this kind of thing, he's doing that real, getting in his 10,000 hours. He is having to produce really regular, fresh ideas and content to a deadline, for this little page, and like just getting in that mileage of writing and being creative.
And what amazing writing practice. Like to get, basically he's being paid to just do what, I don't know about you, but as a writer, like particularly even nowadays, but particularly when I was starting out writing stuff, I think one of the hardest things to get over is that sort of the discipline to actually just sit down and write something. And I in fact, I think it was a previous guest, Stephanie Convery, a journalist who was on the podcast a couple of times, said that she picked this up from someone else, which was the idea that, the way that she would get things written is just sit down for half an hour every day, and she wasn't allowed to do anything except write. And so some days it was okay to just sit there and do nothing, but you weren't allowed to do anything else. And usually by the end of the half an hour, you'd written at least something, And I'm like, that kind of discipline is important, and it's hard. Like you have to learn that the writing needs to come out. It doesn't matter if it's perfect. And here's Terry Pratchett working in this newspaper, basically being told, for your job, you must practice creative writing every week.
Oh, what a dream. Because, you're right. It's hard to justify that time to yourself, and it's hard to justify that time to other people who might be in your life, who might look at you sitting there while other things around the house are going undone, and you're just staring off into space or whatever. And, you look like a lazy good for nothing. And,
And look, and you probably feel like one too, but you're not. You're not. It's an important part of the creative process.
Yes.
Ideating, thinking, getting there. As long as that's what you're actually doing. Let me just put that out there. You sit there playing on your phone. That doesn't count.
No, but that does happen too. Let's not pretend.
Okay, that's true. It does. It does happen. Yes. But look, let's get into this story.
Yes.
Look, if you've read Truckers, this is very, very familiar, but I do want to highlight a few of the things that are different. For example, in this first section, it's just straight in the point. Like it's a kid's story. It's like once upon a time, like it even starts once upon a time, quite literally.
Yeah.
Importantly, Rincemangle, which is a great name, but Rincemangle is a gnome with a G, is a regular fantasy folklore gnome.
Gnome. Yeah.
As opposed to the gnomes in Truckers, who are gnomes with no G and who, as we find out, spoiler alert, are actually from outer space. They're tiny little aliens. But these are not. Rincemangle is not that. He's just a regular old gnome. He's supposed to be dressed like a gnome, but he's got a pointed hat. Like it says, of course. But then he's wearing like a gross outfit made out of bits of moles and mice.
Yeah, mouse skin coat and stuff. And I loved that little description of his filthy little outfit. And he thinks he's the only gnome left in the world, which is that's another kind of echo, I think, a future echo of the Truckers thing, of them not knowing how many gnomes there are or where they are, that kind of thing.
It's got, and even that though, like right at the start, it's got such a Pratchett-y sensibility about it. and lots of little jokes that, I don't know, like I think that kids would appreciate, but also give adults a bit of a chuckle. Like he describes, even more the strange, mysterious land to the north of Blackberry, which, Blackberry is a made up town, but it sounds like a real place. And it's a bit like saying, the weird, unearthly wasteland west of Wagga Wagga. Like it's that kind of feel. It's this unusual place right next to a really normal place. And then, there's this gnome there who's living there and having not a very joyful life, which is, it just sounds sad. But he's also, he's just like, I like his first dialogue is just like, blow this for a lark. I'm wet through and fed up. He's just grumpy. Oh, it's great.
Yeah. But, it's interesting that like this character and these characters, it feels like they're purely reactive. They're just reacting to their situation. And it's so interesting to like compare this to his later work and how rich and complex the motivations of everybody is and unfolding as they do across, multiple stories. And here it's just so, it's a children's story that he's writing on a Thursday evening. And it's just, here are the pieces. This is what happens. This is how they react. And it's so interesting to see Terry Pratchett's work stripped. It's like I never know, the difference between plot and story. I can never get that definition in my head. But it's like it's pure. I'm going to say it's pure plot. It's just stuff happening, right?
Yeah.
Without feelings, without an inner life for any of the characters, really. Beyond blow this for a lark, that's about as deep as we get into anybody's motivation in the entire story.
That's true. I mean, I think there's a little more here than I would expect. I mean, it's hard. I think one of the things that I find it hard with these early stories to get an exact handle on is what age group they're really for. Because, we don't really have, or not in the same way anyway, we don't really have a children's page in the newspaper. Like the children's page in the newspaper, certainly by the time I was reading them in the 80s, was, puzzles and cartoons. There wasn't like short fiction in there.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I don't know how old these kids are, but I'm guessing they're kind of middle grade age.
Well, I read it to my kids. I've got twins who are 6 and I've got another one who's 4. And the one who's 4, he didn't listen to anything I was saying. He was playing with his feet. But
okay, that's normal.
But both of the 6-year-olds really liked it and they laughed a lot. Like, they were really enjoying the story. And they were also, a little bit scared by bits of it and stuff as well. They were having a full experience. So it could work just as well for a bedtime story for really, really young kids as, and maybe, maybe a bit older as well if they're reading it to themselves, definitely.
I mean, I think too, like if we go back, if I think back to our Truckers episode, we had Amy Kaufman, another author on the show. We asked her about this, what's the difference of writing for like kids to writing for adults? And one of the things she said is that, middle grade age kids, they don't care about why things happen. Like they'll just accept what you tell them is happening and they just want stuff to happen in the story. You don't have to have this sort of deep motivation. But I like that in this even there's just enough to kick it along.
Yeah.
Like when the owl turns up, like that's his whole motivation for leaving the moor and going to Blackberry. Some owl turns up and goes, you don't have to stay in this miserable place. There's other places you could be. And he's like, okay. And he leaves.
And he's off.
That's his whole motivation.
Yeah.
The owl's description was pretty good, where the owl's clearly like just bullshitting just a little bit. Just a little bit. It's like, oh yeah, Blackberry's great. And then there's these other places and oh yeah, they're awesome. And he's like, how far away are they? And he's like,
That's a very A.A. Milne, I think, a version of the owl, where the owl is the wise one, but only knows probably 10% more than anybody else, but, has to pass it off. They know more words maybe, but not a lot more facts.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But look, the story proceeds pretty quick. He gets fed up getting caught in the rain, so he hides under a tarpaulin on a lorry. And I mean, I think I learned the word lorry from Truckers when I read it as a kid, because we don't, we wouldn't say lorry here, we'd say ute or truck.
Yes.
But anyway,
like normal people.
I mean, I wasn't going to put it like that, Eddie, but that's
no, we use good normal words here, just normal words, language, proper language. Not like what they use over there. That weird things they say.
You're giving some of our listeners a very bad impression of Australia. No, you're giving them a very accurate impression of what a lot of Australia's like, if we're honest. Thank you. But no, look, he falls asleep, he wakes up, and it's stopped in a department store. So far, minus all of the character stuff and the extra people who are in it, it's very Truckers-y. Except that, Masculine, the main character in Truckers, is really getting on a truck and going, I think getting on a lorry is the way to go. Like, I think this is going to take us somewhere better than where we are. Yeah. Whereas Rincemangle kind of just does it because he's sick of being wet, and then he wakes up in the place that he was trying to get to.
Yeah. Again, I think it's just, he's just a reactive character. He's just bumbling along and things are happening to him. And the start of Truckers, I think, is much, much darker in terms of the desperation of the situation that they're in. It's a genuinely hard and heartbreaking. Oh, the
sequence with the fox is terrifying.
Yeah. Terry's so good at cruelty and fear and finding ways in which the world is cruel for no reason. He finds ways for people to be cruel for a very good reason. Then he finds other ways for them to be cruel for no reason, and ways for the world to be cruel for no reason. And that provides at the heart of a lot of his stories, I think, this really dark little emotional engine that drives people and drives the story. But and I think that's there in Truckers, that they've really got something to get away from, and when they leave the store again, they've got a real strong reason to leave that I don't think is is present in this story.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because what happens is he gets to the store, he meets the one other character with a name in the whole story, whose name is Featherhead. Not as good a name as Rincemangle, if I'm going to be honest. And who shows him around the store.
I like Featherhead.
You like it? Do you imagine? Yeah. Why do you think he's called that? Where does that name come from?
I reckon maybe once he had a feather on his head and it's just stuck. You know what it's like with nicknames.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, you can't get rid of him, can you? But the thing that struck me, that I was thinking about, that kind of off the back of what you were just saying about the cruelty, is that in Truckers, like, the whole store is going to be destroyed. It's unambiguous. There's a term in I forget which role playing game it is. Might be one that I worked on, which is called Our Last Best Hope. But the idea is that when you come up with a threat in the game, it has to be non-negotiable and immediate. So the idea is that it can't be like a threat that you can maybe talk your way around or out of. It has to be something that's like, no, it's happening to you right now, and you can't just avoid it. You have to stop it or run away from it. Like, you can't just go, oh, that doesn't matter. Like, it's difficult. And I think the destruction of the store is like that. Here, the reason they have to leave is that the humans, coincidentally, at the same time Rincemangle shows up, have worked out that there's something under the floorboards. They think it's mice, probably, but they've got a cat, and then later on they find some rat poison. And I mean, that is stuff that, because you have the sequence of the fox in Truckers, which is kind of a bit like the cat here. There is a sequence in Diggers where they do put rat poison down in the quarry, and there's this whole bit where Grimmer and the other gnomes in the quarry, like, have one of the workers tied up who's seen them, and they're like, you were going to poison us. Like, they really give it to him because they're like, these people are evil. So I think there's sort of hints of what it could be, but you're right. It's not really, it's like, oh no, the humans might kill us. We should go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the destruction of the store is so good in Truckers because that is, for them, that's the end of the world. It's the genuine,
it's the apocalypse. Yeah.
Yeah, it is the apocalypse. And, whereas here it's just like, and in the end, to jump ahead, he ends up going and taking everyone back to Even Moor, which was, a place he didn't really like to begin with, didn't seem all that good, didn't have a great alternative for anybody. No. The motivation's bloody all over the shop, mate.
But I guess, I get the impression, he doesn't say they lived happily ever after. In fact, he kind of, because once they've stolen because just to get the plot out, in case you haven't read the story, listener.
Yes.
So Rincemangle gets to the store. He's being shown all the stuff. They're playing with the toys in the toy department. He's like, but you don't even have any guards. what about if they see you? And they're like, oh, they would never see us. And then a cat turns up because they have seen them, or at least they've noticed that they're there, and they all have to run away. Rincemangle saves them from the cat with a bit of clever thinking and distraction. But then they're like, oh, this probably we have to leave. And then they find the poison. They're like, no, we definitely have to leave. They're going to kill us. They know that we're here, which is, I mean, look, that is pretty scary. Was that the bit your kids were scared of? The cat and the poison?
They were scared of the poison. I think the idea of the poison they found scary.
It's pretty full on. I mean, it's a bit like, it's like that in The Amazing Maurice and his Educated Rodents as well.
Yeah, but again, in Maurice and in later stories, you would see the consequences of that poison. Terry would really dwell on how awful, he'd really get into how awful the death would be. It's not enough that it's poison. It's that it would be this just appalling, brutal way to go. Yeah. Whereas here it's just a thing. It's just dropped like that with none of the weight to it, I think, which is fine.
That's true.
This is a very short story for very small children.
Yeah. I think that he's pitched it well. I mean, but it's still got lots of like nice little light touches. But it's just to finish the plot though, that spurs them on to, okay, we've got to leave, but how are we going to leave? We've got to take a whole bunch of stuff with us. There's like 200 or 300 gnomes in the store. We have to have food, and we've learned this way of life here. We don't know how to survive in the outside world. And there's none of the sort of religious and philosophical and political overtones that are present in Truckers. They're just like, oh, but we don't know how to live in the country. But then they find a book about teaching yourself to drive, and this gives Rincemangle the idea, hey, maybe we could drive one of the lorries, and that's how we can get out of here. And they steal one, and they do that, and they get away. And then they go up to the moor on their own. But the thing he leaves it with is he doesn't say they lived happily ever after. He actually leaves it at the end on quite a note of, we know it's going to be hard and difficult, but the little gnomes are like, but this is going to be fun. It'll be cool. But it will be hard work. And we don't know how it works out for them. We just know that they make it back to the moor, and then they, with their supplies and stuff that they've taken from the store. So we don't really know. We just know that they made it there. And there's that nice little coda at the end with the poacher who comes home for breakfast and tells his wife he's seen lights up on the moor. And she's like, no, you haven't. I don't believe you. But maybe you will. And a little bit of a wink to
the reader. I think that was my favorite bit. I actually really loved that. Maybe that's an old trick or something like that. But out of the whole thing, that was the bit that really got me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that way in which he's acknowledging the story, the nature of the story, and he's just inviting you to believe a bit more in this magical possibility. I think that's so exciting for little kids. Maybe that's used in heaps of those kinds of stories, but it was so smart, and I loved it.
Yeah, I think it's had its day. I think it sort of was in fashion, it sort of went out of fashion, it came back in fashion. I think it has waves. That sort of idea of having that framing narrative that says this story is actually true. Like, like something like the Lemony Snicket books have that, because they have the narrator who's pretending that I'm going to tell you about this I'm a real person and this is the story that happened, rather than just an omniscient third person narrator.
Yeah. And now that you mention, I think there's a Beatrix Potter book about a little hedgehog that washes clothes, which ends in a similar kind of thing, just inviting the reader to believe in the story. And again, I think it is it ends with a little hedgehog running up a hill away, and you're invited to say, was she really a hedgehog, or was she a little, hedgehog person who wore clothes? It's now that I think about it, a very similar little flourish at the end.
I think kids love that particularly because that idea of, they're still learning how that works. They know that there's stories and there's the real world, and they start out not knowing that there's a difference, and then they learn there is a difference, and then someone explicitly breaks the wall down between those two things, and it blows their tiny minds. So I think that's probably why you do it. I think there's a certain developmental stage or reading journey stage through your life where you're sort of like, this is amazing. I can't believe someone's done this.
But also you're giving them the choice to believe in something. That's really fun to imagine, that you choosing to, we want to believe that us choosing to believe in things can make them real. It's Peter Pan, it's Tinkerbell, but it's also so many things in Pratchett. It's, is it Hogfather with the...
Yeah, Hogfather, yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is sort of where those ideas begin. is that invitation to believe in things. You know, yeah, exactly like in Hogfather, where Death talks about how believing in things like the Tooth Fairy and the Hogfather and these silly little stories that nonetheless sort of inform your morality or ethics lead to you believing in things that are no more tangible but still vitally important for your understanding of the world. Yeah, absolutely. I also just want to talk about how funny this story is, because you say your kids laughed frequently. Were there any, what were the big laughs for them? Because this is the interesting, I don't get to read stories to kids. When I'm working with kids, I'm getting them to do stories. I don't get to tell them a story. So I'm intrigued to know, what were their big laughs for them? Can you remember any?
I remember that they found the image of them driving down the lorry down the road and crashing into lots of things. They found that really funny. And
I can imagine.
And that's such a great scene, and you can see why that scene alone would make you excited to explore this story more. I think it's a beautiful image. You love the idea of little people, little things working together and being able to achieve enormous things, and the fact that the thing that they're achieving is just this very normal thing for us is it's so great. But also, kids want to believe that, you know, that they could have the power to influence the world, and that, you know, the kids are the tiny people. And reading, I saw a reference, and you might have already covered this in Truckers, but I saw a reference to a little non-fiction introduction that Terry had done to a staged version of Truckers that's in. Which one's is it? The blip of a screen or a blink of a keyboard? In his one about non-fiction
the slip
writing.
of a keyboard, the non-fiction
The slip
one,
of the keyboard. It's called The Big Store, and he writes about his first time in a big department store and how just incredibly magical it is, and how vividly and intensely he remembers that stuff. And
that's right.
I think writing a story like this and making the gnomes be even smaller and dwarfed by this enormous bright world that they don't understand any of, but it is so intense and all-consuming, is it's just a great way to just tap back into and concentrate, refine and inhale the essence of that feeling of being a tiny kid in a big store. That's so exciting.
Yeah, that's right. I'd forgotten about that. That was a great piece, and I identify with that too, because I grew up in a country town, and the biggest place I ever went to was like our local big department store. We had like one of those combined Kmart / Kohl's mega things like on the edge of town. And you'd go there and, you know, it was so big it had like kind of like this department store. It had like a cafe in the middle of it because you might be shopping for ages, and my mum would always like go in there and have a cappuccino, and I could sit in there and have something to drink as well. And it felt like a special thing that we were doing. And I'd see stuff in there that I wouldn't see anywhere else. It was like a window into this bigger world that was bigger than my town, you know?
Yeah, well, it is its own world, self-contained universe, but also that idea of like, oh, what would it be like if I could spend the night in here after everybody else had gone home, and I could go into all the shops and I could have anything I wanted, and I could play on that little helicopter ride thing or whatever. That's you know, that's the night at the museum dream of kids, I think, to have a world of their own that they can explore. And that's what this does, or starts to do. You know, there's so much that isn't in this, but could be.
That's true. I think we hang on to that as adults, though. Like I used to run a comedy tour at the museum for the comedy festival here in Melbourne. And we did it after hours. And look, as much as the gags were good and it was a fun event, I think half the draw was just going to the museum when it was dark and there was nobody else there. Like, people just wanted that experience where you feel like, I'm not supposed to be here. Ooh. So I think we hang on to that idea. It's a feeling we never quite leave behind. There's a couple of things in here. I don't know. There's a famous series of books called The Borrowers. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yes, I am.
There's a bit where I wasn't sure if it was just a gag or if Terry was sort of acknowledging his predecessors, but there's a line where he says, you know, he's describing what the gnomes are doing, where they've like set themselves up. And he says they've built themselves a home under the floorboards between the toy shop and the do-it-yourself department, though they had borrowed quite a lot of railway track from the toy shop and built a sort of underground railway. And I was like, Now, I mean, that's funny because it's like, they borrowed it. It's like they haven't borrowed it, they've stolen it. But also, Is he just sort of going, I know I'm not the first person to write about this.
That is a great observation. I hadn't thought of that when I read it, and I love that interpretation, that he is also, maybe he knows that he's also borrowing the whole idea of these little people living in our world.
Yeah, I think for me, though, the thing about his stories, like the Truckers books, this story, the Carpet People and the short stories that like this, came before that, I think the thing for me about them is that apart from, where it all goes wrong, it's not really about the little people interacting with regular humans, which you see like in The Borrowers, there's a lot of that. And there's, stuff in either they're always hiding from them or whatever, but it's more about them just surviving in our world and giving us a new perspective on our world.
Yeah.
And I kind of really like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what so much of his work does in different ways. It's just like, it's just another way of reflecting on our world. This one, he's doing it in our world rather than, in a different world where bits of our world just pop up. It's sort of, almost the inverse. But yeah, I love that stuff. I love it.
Yeah.
It's good. It's good writing. It's good stuff.
It is good stuff. We've got some great questions from our listeners, but I think just before we get on to those, I do just want to take a moment to call out a few any other little specific bits that were your faves. Did you have any?
I loved the joke, if you could read, I'd send you a postcard. If I could write. That is an Alpha joke.
That's great.
And I think that might be an old joke format as well, but it's just so economical with words. It's just that's my joke of the story, I reckon.
Yeah, I agree. I think it might be, I don't know if that's a Pratchett original. I think Pratchett was writing kind of at a time and in a tradition where he felt fine using some folk jokes that were just in the atmosphere. Like there's a famous one from Eric where the librarian is hanging out above the really way too sexy magic books. So it's warm.
Yeah.
And they describe, he has a footnote that says the difference between something that's erotic and something that's kinky is using the feather or using the whole chicken. And that is not a Pratchett original joke like that.
Oh, really?
Other people had come up with that before him. Yeah. I found this the other day. I was looking for something else and I actually tracked out, there was a Kenny Everett video show episode where he just tells that joke as one of his punk characters. Like there's no sketch. It's just the punk doing that joke. And I'm like, okay. And that was a few years before that book was published. So I'm like, okay, there's other stuff as well. But now, Pratchett is the one whose version is remembered because his books are the ones that have sold millions and millions of copies around the world. Yeah.
Written by the winners.
Yeah. But also, I think that those are jokes where you would never in a million years be able to find out who the original writer of that joke was.
But, I mean, this one, I think, is the thing I could compare it to is a joke that my dad tells, which I think is from an old Two Ronnie sketch or something, where they're just talking in letters. So it's like M, we could have some M and X, like for ham and eggs. And I think it's like,
oh, yeah.
If we had some M, we could have M and X if we had any X. It's, and if you take that as just a, almost like pronumerals as they are in that sentence, you could replace them with the same words from this sentence and it would be the exact. Yeah, it's just I guess it is just a formula, but so well applied.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's the craft that you do it with, because I think we all do that as comedy writers. We're all writing jokes where, oh yeah, I've seen this kind of joke, but I'm going to write my specific version of this joke, which only works in the context of this sketch or this episode or this stand-up set that I'm telling. And if you weren't super familiar with a lot of comedy, you probably wouldn't recognize it as even being similar to another joke. But, once you get in, it's like anything. Once you get into the craft and you get into the weeds and you learn a lot about it, you see those patterns, you see those things everywhere.
It's the folk music tradition. If it's good enough for Bob Dylan,
totally.
It's good enough for a stand-up open mic night at the Exford.
Absolutely. And we know Pratchett was a big folk fan. He was a bit of a folkie.
Yeah.
I do like that they take the time to make Rincemangle a tweed suit, for no apparent reason. They just like, we don't, but, well, there is a reason. Featherhead says to his friend in the suit department, where there's a bunch of gnomes who are very, very like, say, oh, suits you, sir, suits you. They're very in that mold. But he says, my friend here in the moleskin trousers, can't you make him something natty and tweed? We can't have a gnome who looks like he's just stepped out of a mushroom. And you're like, well, yeah. Which is great because, of course, that's what we expect gnomes to be like. But not this one. The whole bit with the cat was pretty good. We'll come back to that when we get to our listener questions. I do like that there's this sort of lore of gnomes in this story that is never really deeply investigated. Like, we know that they wear hats, of course. And it's established that Rincemangle thinks he's the only one, but the ones in the store know that gnomes used to live in the country, not in the town. But that's pretty much all we know about them. Yeah,
they've become urbanized. I think of it as it being a bit like the Matrix. They're not living in the real world, and Rincemangle is like the one, or Morpheus, where he is. I can show you the nightmare of the real world, basically, and he takes them out of that that ignorance is bliss thing that they're in, and he's like, no, this is what it's like out here. It's wet, and there are foxes.
Yeah,
and that's where it ends. That's how the first Matrix film ends as well, and that's the end of my thesis.
Well, now I want to write Rincemangle Revolutions and explore what happened next.
Well, that's what happened. He turned it into a trilogy.
That is true. He did turn it into a trilogy. And he also talked, I don't know that we talked about this when we talked about the Truckers books, but he did talk about possibly returning to the gnomes after Wings, but it never happened. But I mean, he was never going to, he had so many ideas that didn't make it. And some of them would have been great, I'm sure, but
no, I was really satisfied with the end of that trilogy, and I didn't feel any desire for anything else.
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, I love the gnomes. I would have enjoyed another story, I'm sure, but I don't think it needed it. I thought it was fine where it ended. It was good. We're free to imagine what life is like on Planet Gnome. Just as here, we're free to imagine what life is like on Even Moor, when they're all well kitted out with gear and supplies, and there's 300 of them and not one of them. Yeah, yes. I think hopefully they have a magical time in their strange mystery moor. Yeah. It's never established what's strange or mysterious about it, except that gnomes live there. So, who knows?
But it's wet and shit. Yeah.
It is wet and shit, and there's at least one owl.
No, it doesn't seem all that strange or mysterious.
Yeah, I mean, also, I don't know, if I was a gnome, I don't think I'd be just casually chatting to owls. Like, if you're a gnome, you're exactly the right size to be eaten by an owl. So,
that's true.
I would be very afraid.
Why are foxes a problem and owls okay?
Yeah, well, I guess because we like owls. They don't eat our chickens. They only eat mice, which humans don't like. So it's very sort of human biased opinion. Whereas, I'm pretty sure in the Bromeliad, they are scared of owls.
Yeah.
But look, there's lots of nice little moments and things in this story. Do have a read for yourself, even if you've read Truckers. It's just a fun time. And I recommend, if you've not read any of the others, I do recommend his other short stories for kids that come from the same sort of time. There's 4 books worth. And some of them are like, that's okay. Some of them are really good, though. And they're all pretty funny.
Yeah, I'm definitely encouraged to read more of these to my kids based on this.
All right, well, look, we should get into some listener questions because this is going to be a pretty short episode because we're talking about a pretty short story, but we got some great questions. So let's dive into them. The first one is from Steve Lee on Twitter, who noticed the line, "The gnomes formed themselves into a human pyramid. It's interesting to see how human-centric this story is. By the time of Truckers, everything is well and truly from the gnome's perspective. So it would have been like a gnome pyramid. I thought that was interesting. Did you pick that up when you were first reading it?
Not at all. No, I did not. No. And I didn't, I think what you're seeing there is the fact that these were probably written in a huge hurry. And he didn't have time to get into all the details of the world building, which, no one can build a world like him. And later in his life, he would get down into all of those details, and everything would work and everything would be internally consistent most of the time. But this is filler, ultimately, I think.
I mean, look, if I could write this is filler. Like, I wish I could write as good as this filler on my days.
It's incredible filler.
It's pretty straightforward. It's not as nuanced as you say, but it's still solid. Like, the prose is good, the jokes are funny. It clips along at just the right pace, I reckon, and it works broken up into 8 little bits. I think those are things that are not as easy to do as you might think. I'd love to know if he plotted out the whole idea first and then just wrote a little bit of it at a time, or if he just made it up as he went along. I'd love to know which way he did it.
I have a feeling he was making it up as he went along. Just based on the fact that for me, them just returning to Even Moor, when Even Moor at the start is set up as such a crap place, and the fact that they just end up there again at the end, it makes it feel like these are just choices he's making on the fly. To like, well, I need an ending. Yeah. I guess, where's he come from? What does he know? What's been set up already? I guess he goes back there. This is my theory, is that a lot of his stories are characterized and defined by yearning. I feel like a lot of the time characters yearn for things. And they're also, I think, for a lot of the time very sentimental about a more honest or decent time or something like that for the way things were, and things being the way they were for a reason, whether or not that was right. And I think there's none of that in this story. Nobody's yearning.
No, Rincemangle was just annoyed, really, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. And I think in the Bromeliad, there's a real sense of things that have been lost, connections that have been lost. There's the sense of there was this great gnome civilization that's disappeared. They've all lost something by this fragmentation and this passage of time and this desperation that they're in. And they're driven by that. But that's not present. And I think, I really think that that's the feeling that I come away with so often from reading his stories, that people really want things really strongly.
This is something you talk about in comedy writing, when you're making, particularly like in something like a sitcom, when you're talking about a sitcom character, often one of the things you can do to really kind of give them drive that leads them into comic situations is to have something that they really want, but then make sure that really is not the same as the thing that they really need. So that character will be always striving for something and wanting something and going after something that is not the answer to their problems, that only makes their life more complicated or worse in some way. And they never really get what they need, or they don't want what they need, but they do get it,
Yes. I think that's more what Terry would do. People do get what they need, ultimately, regardless of what they think they want.
Happens when death comes for them as well.
But that's what he discovered the way to make his story so emotionally satisfying, which is just like, what are the chances of that existing alongside just the most incredibly constructed jokes you could imagine? To have emotional stakes and emotional arcs that are so rewarding. I can't, it just doesn't seem possible. Like Wodehouse couldn't do that. He could write the jokes, but there wasn't a fucking emotional arc in sight.
No. Well, they were very, I think that, Jeeves and Wooster, they're like sitcom characters. They don't evolve because he wants to write 50 books about them. He doesn't want them to change, because then he has to change how he writes about them, and what people loved about them is not there anymore. In the same way, Sherlock Holmes doesn't. Well, he does a bit, actually. That's not as good an example, but he remains essentially the same. He becomes a bit warmer and a bit less, of a jerk, but otherwise he stays pretty much the same. So I think that's a very sitcom-y way to write.
And I suppose Rincewind is one of those characters who probably doesn't change all that much.
Yeah, I think, look, I've been thinking about that a lot, because as we've been reading the Science of Discworld books for the podcast, I really feel like those late books, I think the main thing that's changed for him is he's kind of just accepted what he is. Like he's still a coward, but he also has just sort of got to a level of, I understand the way the world works, and maybe I can use that to my advantage at least a little bit. You know, like even in like something like The Last Hero where he says, I don't want to volunteer, but I'm going to because I know the alternative is I end up on this mission anyway, you know, like, and then in the Science of Discworld books, he saves the day several times because of that sort of genre awareness that he has about the situations that he's in. I like that about him, that he's sort of grown into that a little.
Is it a Rincewind line to say that the whole point of running away is not to live to fight another day, but to live to run away another day? Is that Rincewind?
I think that is a Rincewind one. Words to live by.
So good.
Speaking of Rincewind, obviously his name was inspired by this. We got a question from Paul Patiki on Twitter, who says that before I heard it properly spoken out loud, I thought Rincewind's name was produced like winding a clock, so rincewind. And seeing that in this story, Pratchett uses the name Rincemangle, which is another thing that you wind. Have we all been saying Rincewind wrong? I mean, I think the answer is no, because there's a lot of official audiobooks and readings of Pratchett saying the name. But I had that same thought, actually, Paul. This is a thing that often happens with Pratchett, any fantasy. You're reading a lot of words that are made up that you've never seen before. You have to figure out how to pronounce them. Do you have any pronunciations that you will admit to us that you think now are maybe a bit ridiculous?
Oh my goodness, I'm sure I have had them.
I'll put you on the spot. Sorry, Andy. I shouldn't do that.
Yeah, but no. I mean, look, this is a great question, but I mean, what do you want us to say? There's nowhere to go with this. I don't have.
No.
It's a very good observation. I don't have an opinion. The only thing I will say is that having read A Life with Footnotes, wasn't there a mention in there of how Rincewind was a name? Somebody pointed out to Terry later on that Rincewind actually was already a character.
It's in something else. Yeah. I think people are always doing that.
But how does that work with the Rincemangle chronology? You know.
Well, I think, who knows? I mean, I can imagine, look, we'll never know, for starters. We'll never know. Who knows how somebody else's brain works? But I can imagine a scenario where if Terry ever read the book that has a character named Rincewind in it, or whatever it was, and it went into his brain, then when he was a young man at 25, he's like, I kind of like that name, Rincewind. How could I change that? What's funny? Rince clock, Rincemangle. Oh, that's good. And so maybe that was the inspiration for Rincemangle. And then later in his life, he's like, Rincemangle, that was a good name, but it's not quite right. It's too silly. It's too silly for this character. I need something slightly more serious.
Yeah.
Rincewind. That's quite good. And he's forgotten about the original source. So that's one possible explanation.
I actually think that was a beautiful audio book. You've created an audio play for me there. That was a beautiful dramatization of this circular thought process. And I think it's flawless. I believe it. Absolutely.
All right, good. We've solved that mystery then. That's great. But I think the other thing is Pratchett, because he puts so many references in on purpose, people are always seeing ones that aren't really there. Like when he uses an archetype that has existed for a long time and people go, that's a reference to blah. And he's like, no, we're both drawing on the same idea. It's not a reference to that specifically. They're just both drawing from the same well, which I think is that's how he put it. Fishing from the same river or fishing from the same stream was the phrase that he used when people sort of said, did you base so-and-so on this other character from this other book? And he's like, no, we're just fishing from the same stream.
I love that.
Here's a good question that might segue from that a little bit, because he also liked to fish from his own stream. I think we can agree. And Rin Betancourt asked us on Facebook.
Now that's a euphemism.
I know. I feel bad about that. But sorry, Rin. Sorry to take your question with this filthy language. But Rin asked, what other characters have we seen modified or changed as Sir Terry Pratchett's writing improved? And I think I want to open this up a little bit because, yes, there are examples like this where it's very clearly taken the same idea and done it again. And you see that with like jokes, you see that with things. But I think also there's the sort of same archetype, like we were just talking about, or type of character or situation that he's done multiple different ideas. And they're not necessarily the same, but they sort of do evolve and change as he writes. He did like to recycle ideas, and I think that's it's a fine instinct as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, you can see how strongly and how quickly characters, as soon as he had a character in the Discord series, how quickly it evolved and became so much richer. Like, you look at how Granny Weatherwax changed from equal rights to what she became so quickly in Weird Sisters and all those other stories. Those first characters, they're like, it feels like they're just a sketch, they're just a shadow of what they're going to go on and become. I think probably when the world, when the Discworld was young in literary terms, everything was new and he was putting down these characters. Then once they exist, he's coming back to them and giving them so much more and building the world. And yeah, you can talk about the comparison between this story and Truckers or something, but like it's there between Guards and Men at Arms as well. It feels like every time he introduces a new character, the second book for me always feels like a step change, an exponential increase in the richness and the texture of the characters. Yeah, the second book in a series is always the one that I love the most because that's the one that really sets my brain on fire, I think. Yeah, it becomes so much more exciting, I think.
The one that always comes to mind for me when I think about how he's sort of taken an idea and then evolved it and changed it is, I'm going to go back to Rincewind again, but in the really early books, there's this recurring thing, particularly in The Colour of Magic, where Rincewind is continually disappointed that things run on magic. He's always hoping that there's like some higher order to the universe. And then there's that whole bit where they get, in order for them not to die, there's some magical weirdness that transports them into an alternate universe where they're on a plane when their dragon is going to fall out of the sky.
Yeah.
And then they go back into the
weirdest thing
world.
in all of the Discworld books. That's the strangest
I know. And there's nothing like it in any of the other ones. It's so weird.
Yeah.
But in that alternate universe, he's like a theoretical physicist or something, or a nuclear scientist of some sort, which is in part, from his desire for science. And then that completely just disposed of later on, really. He never comes back. But what does come back is the character of Ponder Stibbons, who starts out as just, in moving pictures, he's just a nerd wizard. But then he becomes the science wizard. He's the one who's always looking for meaning and trying to make sense of the way magic works in a way that the other wizards don't really care about. Like they care about big dinners and, the philosophical implications of tableness, but they don't really care about how many thorns it takes to, create a billiard ball.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. And I like that he sort of come back to that and gone, okay, well, how do I, Rincewind just did that because he was cynical in the early books. But if I make a whole character and that's their thing, what else does that mean about them? And it probably means, well, they're quite serious. They're quite organized. They take things seriously. Yeah. So that's probably my favorite one. I think I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Ian Banks for us a great question on Discord, but I think we've kind of covered most of the things you asked about, Ian. What are the biggest differences between this and the Bromeliad? And I think we've talked about a lot of those things, but he did bring up
the yearning.
The yearning. It's the yearning. I did like this one, though, and we haven't talked about this so much, but he thinks Pratchett's styles developed more of a voice in the novel. These newspaper story versions, they have this sort of generic, whimsical, omniscient narrator style, is how Ian puts it, which is probably, as we were talking about, forced on him by the role of writing for a kid's page. Whereas in the books, it's a more cinematic and knowing kind of narration. And I think that's pretty spot on. What do you like about his sort of later narration compared to this?
You can see how early on there are flourishes that feel a bit more forced. Things like, was it even at the start of The Colour of Magic, that C, how he uses that C, and then he describes Great Atuan, and then he says C this, and then C that, those things that feel like he's really trying to be a fantasy author as well.
Yeah, he's like, look at me, I'm like...
Yeah, I can do this stuff. And he loses interest in that, and he just becomes his own thing. And he becomes so self-aware that he can play in all the meta tropes of that he would have used as just a gimmick early on, and they become, integral parts of the world. And he's able to, just have his cake and eat it too. Yeah, it's great to watch it happen.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot on this podcast about the sort of cinematic style of his writing. We don't usually talk about that in terms of the narration, but more in terms of the way the plot moves and, you know, the fact that he doesn't have any chapters, and he'll do things like shot matching where the end of one scene kind of matches something at the start of the next scene thematically or visually. All that kind of stuff is in there, and it does feel very different to, a really short story like this.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I never really want there to be movies or TV shows or anything of the Pratchett stuff, because I feel like we've already got it. We've got the perfect cinematic version of these stories. No matter what you do, you couldn't do a depiction of Ankh-Morpork that is going to give us anything more than what we've got. It's always going to be less. There's so much in there. And how can you ever cinematically make a river that is so thick that you could walk across it? How can that be satisfying?
Break bits off and eat them. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think you're absolutely right, though. Yeah, it is so cinematic. And I'm not somebody who visualizes things in my mind as I read them, but you really don't have to with him. It's all there.
No, you really get a good sense of it, even if you're not doing that. Yeah, I agree. Joel Mullen had a great exchange with Ian on our Discord. Joel asked the question, who has better vision, a cat or a T-Rex? Which is a reference to the fact that in this story, Rincemangle distracts the cat, but then everyone's running away. They're trying to get into their trapdoor to get into their houses under the floorboards and be safe from the cat. And Rincemangle just says, stand still, he won't be able to see you. And it is very Jurassic Park. Do you reckon Michael Crichton read this? Do you think that's where he got the idea? Because he certainly didn't get it from paleontologists.
The whole thing. Let's blow the lid off this right now. The whole Jurassic Park franchise is just a straight rip-off of Rincemangle, the Gnome of Even Moor.
Yeah. Joel and Ian had a bit of an exchange because Ian said, do you mean right now or is it general comparison? Because if it's right now, my money's on the cat, which makes sense. Well, the T-Rex is not being alive. And Ian also, after a bit more clarification, posted a video or an article about what cats see, which I would just put in the notes, but I do want to mention it on the podcast because it's called What Do Cats See Through Their Eyes? And then in brackets, in all caps, it just says mysterious feline vision, which I thought was a bit over the top. But I'll put a link to that in the episode notes if you want to learn more about how cats really see things. David Butler got very excited because he's a listener who is usually reading quite a way behind the current episode of the podcast, but was able to read this story and get a couple of questions in. And I think we've kind of covered a couple of them, but you were just talking about how you don't visualize things when you're reading. But David was saying that, you know, the picture of the tiny people, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but the picture of the tiny people driving a lorry via strings and levers and platforms was so very clear both in this story and in Truckers. And it made him wonder how much of Sir Terry's works are built around a single or couple of clearly imagined scenes. Do you reckon, and this is apparently something that C.S. Lewis has, like he describes seeing these clear pictures in his head about certain things, like the example that David gives is the fawn carrying packages through a snowy wood under a lamppost. And he asks, do you reckon Terry did this? Do you reckon you can pick out any clear picture moments in any of his books that you think that was the idea that he had and then he built the whole thing around it? I will throw one out there, and it's less a scene and it's more a joke, but it is also a scene. I'm pretty sure he's on record somewhere as having said that Weird Sisters just came out of the idea for that first joke where the witches say, when shall we three meet again? And then there's a pause and then, you know, and they're on the hill and there's the lightning. And then one of them says, well, I can do next Thursday. I think that was the scene that he was like, I want to do that. How do I make that work? And that's why it ended up being, you know, Macbeth / Hamlet / witches. So I think that's one for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look at Small Gods and say that, like, that image of the turtle being carried by the eagle or something like that. I mean,
and then like
falling and hitting the guy on the head.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the whole punchline of that story is built around how powerful that image is.
That's true.
Yeah, you know, and things like sorcery, the towers battling and being held together with the power of these wizards' minds. They're fantastic, rich scenes. but I don't know. I couldn't tell you if what order they came in.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are there.
Yeah. I do feel like I kind of agree with David, though, that when I was reading this, I was like, yeah, I think he wanted to write the book because the idea of these little gnomes driving this truck was just such a great idea that he wanted to do it again bigger. And, that's why the book's called Truckers, even though it's not really about the truck journey. Like, that's sort of the plot thing. But what it's about is, this theme of having to relearn what you think you've learned and, see the bigger world that's around you and understand where you've made assumptions or gotten used to a certain way of thinking that isn't what everyone else thinks. And I think that was what drove him to write it more so than, because this was one of the other things David asked is, I had all these questions when I was reading this story, which was like, where do the gnomes come from? What's their deal? And he was like, oh, wait, no, I know the answer to this because they're in the other books. But I feel like this visual was more the impetus to write those stories than those questions.
To go back to A Life with Footnotes again, I think there are some discussions in there of Terry's process and that he didn't really have a plan for his stories, that he would just work his way through them and then the perfect ending would just emerge out of what the pieces that he'd put on the table.
Yeah, because he talked in several places, not just in the biography, but previously about the Valley of Mist. If you remember that, he sort of talks about when he was plotting things, he'd sort of start on one side of this valley and he could see the peak on the other side that he wanted to get to. And maybe he could see a couple of big trees poking up out of the mist, but he didn't really know the way. He just sort of knew the vague direction. And so he just aimed for the tree. So I feel like those trees and that other side of the valley were these sort of scenes that he could see in his head. It's like, well, that's what I want to happen in the book. And there were things like, the gnomes driving the truck and, the tortoise falling on the head and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Look, we've got almost the last question here, which is from Sven. Sven always likes to send us one. And here's one. I don't know if you'll be able to answer this. It depends what short stories you've read before. But he asks about short stories in general. Do you like the rough ideas in the short stories better or the longer book versions where he's done them again? For example, Sven mentions that he really likes the witch trials that appear in the short story, which is not very short at all, The Sea and Little Fishes. And he liked it better in the short story than he did when it appears again in the later Tiffany Aching books. It's in A Hatful of Sky. I would agree with that, actually, because I think the witch trial, we actually get to see the witch trial in the short story. I don't know that I have a good answer for your specific questions, Sven, but what I will say is that I think when you have a short story, you don't really have time for a lot of plot. You can't really have like a whole bunch of stuff that happens. So often what you can do instead is just explore one idea in a fair bit of detail to make a short story work. And that means that if you've got an idea like, well, what if there were witch trials, but they were trials that the witches put on for themselves, like to test themselves? A, it's a great pun, but B, it's a funny idea. And you can just explore that. You can just have a short story that's just about the witch trials. A whole book about the witch trials wouldn't really work. You'd need a whole plot where the witch trials were kind of incidental, I think, which is what you get in the later Tiffany Aching book. So I think when there's an idea like that, sometimes the short story is better because it like gets into it a bit more.
I don't like short stories, so I'm gonna disagree.
I have ruined. What have I done to you, Andy? I've invited you on the podcast to talk about a medium you don't even enjoy.
No, it's fine. I just always, when there are emotional stakes in a short story, it always feels cheap to me. I feels like I've been dumped into this situation and expected to care about these people that I've just met, and it feels unearned. And when there aren't emotional stakes, it feels just like a little piece of a trinket, a little a device, which I can really like if it's a great device, if it's a really cool little exploration of a concept. And it sounds like maybe the witch trials might be that. Yeah, I never know how to pronounce his name. Borges?
Oh, yeah.
The Argentinian writer. Love his stuff because that's very conceptual, but generally I will like a longer story, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I would recommend The Sea and Little Fishes because it's a very long. It was originally published in a collection of novellas, so that'll give you an idea about how long it is. Yeah, and it's great. It's a lot of fun.
Great.
Look, that kind of brings us to the end of our questions, though. So I want to say thank you, Andy, so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Because I hadn't read this story before, I was surprised at how similar it is to the Truckers books, but I'm very happy with that because it's given me an excuse to talk about them a little bit more and to get you on the show. So thank you very much for coming along. If people want to find out more about your work, you are a podcaster, so you do the Pop Test, which is like a science comedy quiz show for the ABC.
Yes, although there's no, we got discontinued, so there's no more Pop Test.
No.
There's 2 seasons that you can go back and enjoy. Yeah, science quiz with comedians and scientists.
And they are very enjoyable.
We had a lot of fun making those for the ABC. But yeah, those are all still there to enjoy. And yeah, I also have the podcast 2 in the Think Tank that I do with my life colleague, Alistair Tremblay-Birchall.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where we come up with 5 sketch ideas each episode. And it's just pure nonsense. So
yes,
if you've got nothing else to do, maybe why not try that?
Excellent sounding nonsense. Now we've discussed a children's story today, and you are an author, and the books that you've written are for children, are they not?
Yeah, that's right. I've written 2 short graphic novels with my friend Peter Thomas, who's an illustrator, in the Gustav and Henry series, and it's about a pig and a dog. They're best friends and they go on adventures. And, they do silly things like going to the moon to retrieve a lost shuttlecock and going back in time to return a library book.
I mean, they sound very Pratchett-y to me.
I would be
great.
lying if the influence wasn't in there somewhere. Yeah.
What kind of age are those intended for?
Yeah, so young readers, I think, if your kid is reading at 5 or 6, they might enjoy them, and then hopefully kids who are 12 and 13 have enjoyed them as well. So basically, buy them. Just buy a copy. You'll know somebody who wants to read it.
Just get into it.
There's jokes in there for adults.
All right.
Well, if you like the play The Dollhouse, there's an extended riff on The Dollhouse in Volume 2.
Wow. Okay. All right. Now I've got to check this out. This is amazing. Okay. That's fantastic. If people want to find out more about those books and your podcast, where's the best place for them to go on the interwebs to find out more about what you're up to?
Oh, I mean, just Google my name, I suppose, is the yeah, that'll get you there somewhere. I had a website, but I didn't maintain it, and I couldn't be bothered paying for the thing.
Can I ask, we both have names that are made up of very common, sort of white Anglo dude names. Do you have the problem that there's other people with your name more famous than you? Because I certainly have that problem.
I have the problem that there's another children's author called Andy Matthews who's more successful than I am. Yes.
Oh no!
That doesn't eat away at me or anything. That's fine. All
right. Well, then, just so the listeners know, the name of your books are
Gustav and Henry.
Gustav and Henry.
Henri. Yeah.
I'm going to look them up. They sound great. Well, look, once again, Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thanks also to you, listener, for listening to Pratchett each month. It's the reason that we make the show, and we really appreciate having you as our audience. We also appreciate all of you who send in questions, those of you who are subscribers and help us keep the lights on here at Splendid Chaps Productions, and everyone who helps us out any other way. You can do that if you want. You can go to our website, pratchettpodcast.com, find out how you can support the show. One very important way you can do that is just by telling people. If you know anyone who you think would enjoy it, post about it on social media, put it in an email newsletter. I don't know. Do you even have those anymore? Who can say? But we would love you to let people know about the show if you do enjoy it. And indeed, let us know. You can get in touch with us and answer our questions. For example, one question we have is we definitely won't be doing an individual episode for every single short story that Pratchett wrote. He did write, despite some of the things he says, quite a lot of them, and they're not all long enough to sustain a whole episode. But we would love to know which ones you'd like us to do. We'll definitely be doing all of the rest of the Discworld ones we haven't done yet, but if there's one that you particularly like us to talk about, let us know. You can email us at chat@pratchettpodcast.com, or you can get in touch with us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And another thing I need to tell you, we're also now on Mastodon. If you're not familiar with Mastodon, it's another social media platform. It's a little bit like Twitter. It's a microblogging platform kind of thing. And if you are on Mastodon and you'd like to follow us there, you can find us at pratchat@mendeddrum.org. Yes, that really is our instance name. We don't run it, but where else could we go, really? It seemed like the only appropriate place. Now, one of the main reasons people get in touch with us on social media is to ask us questions for our next episode. And the next one is quite exciting because for the very first time, we're turning to Pratchett's non-fiction work. Yes, we will be discussing some of his writing about genre and fandom, and we'll have a special guest, author, publisher, and role player Peter M. Ball. Oh, I'm so excited about this. Now, because they're quite short, we're going to cover a few of them together. So specifically, we're going to be discussing the pieces Kevin's, Weird Ideas, Let There Be Dragons, and Notes from a Successful Fantasy Author, all of which you can find in the first section of A Slip of the Keyboard, titled A Scribbling Intruder. Now, we're also, as a bonus, we're going to be covering the introduction, which was written by Neil Gaiman, because it's our first episode about that book. And because it seemed fair, we're also going to talk about Pratchett's writing about Neil Gaiman from the same book, Neil Gaiman, Amazing Master Conjurer. Now, we'll have a list of all of those pieces on our website. We'll put a blog post up there so that you don't have to try and remember them. But if you read those and you've got questions, please send them in. You can use the hashtag Pratchett65 or just send us an email. And the episode after that, it's back to the novels. And we're going to welcome back a guest who we ended up talking about this episode. That's Amy Kaufman. She's coming back, fantastic author and wonderful guest from all the way back when we discussed truckers. Must be like 4 years ago now or longer. Anyway, Amy's coming back to talk to us about the fourth Tiffany Aching book, I Shall Wear Midnight. That episode will be out in early April. So if you've got questions about I Shall Wear Midnight, get reading now and get those questions in by mid-March using the hashtag Pratchett66. But that's it. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, don't go listening to any owls. You've been listening to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast with Pratchetter Ben McKenzie, that's me, and guest Andy Matthews. Pratchett is produced and edited by me, with music by David Ashton. We're on Twitter, Mastodon, Instagram, and Facebook, and you can listen to past episodes and support the production of new ones via pratchettpodcast.com. Join the conversation for this episode using the hashtag Pratchett64.
Pratchett is brought to you by Splendid Chaps Productions. We make entertainment for your ears, like the Doctor Who podcast Splendid Chaps and time travel comedy series Night Terrors. To find out more, visit splendidchaps.com.